This is Concept E classes, and today we'll deal with chapter 12 of class 8 science, friction. In this chapter, first we'll see what is the force of friction, what are the factors affecting friction or what causes friction, friction a necessary evil. In this topic we'll deal the advantages and disadvantages of friction. Then we'll see how we can increase or reduce the friction and how wheels help in reducing friction, and there also we'll see the different types of friction, and finally we'll discuss about fluid friction. Force of friction. In chapter 11 we saw an example while studying friction. When a ball it rolls along the ground, it gradually slows down and it comes to rest. Here we can see that no force appears to be acting, but the speed of the ball gradually decreases. This is due to friction. The friction, it opposes the motion of the ball and it brings it to rest. And we can see that the ball and the ground, they are in contact with each other. So we can define friction as a force opposing the motion of an object when the surface of the object comes into contact with the surface of another. There are another examples of friction as well. Here the car, it comes to rest when we apply brakes or when the engine is switched off. That is because the friction, it opposes the motion of the car and brings it to rest. Similarly, when a boat, it comes to rest when we stop rowing. Here also the friction of the water and the boat brings the boat to stop. Now what is the direction of the force of friction? The force of friction is always opposite to the direction of the motion of the object. That is, if we try pushing a block from left to right, the friction will act from right to left direction. It will be opposite to the direction of motion of the object. Now let's see what are the factors affecting friction. The main factors affecting friction are nature of the surface and weight of the object on the surface. So first let's see how the nature of the surface affects friction. Now friction is caused by the irregularities on the two surfaces in contact. Even though certain surfaces appears to be smooth, there are a large number of minute irregularities in them. Now the smooth surfaces, as they have minute irregularities, the friction is less. Whereas in rough surfaces, there are very large number of irregularities. Hence, the friction is more. These irregularities on the two surfaces, they lock onto one another. That is, if we try moving an object, the irregularities of the two surfaces, they lock into one another, causing friction. Now let's see an example. If we try pushing a book on a table, there is less friction as the surface of the table is smooth. But if we try moving a box in the ground, here we can see that the friction is more as the surface is rough and more force is required to move the box. Hence, the force of friction is greater if a rough surface is involved. Similarly, if you take a case of this ball, the ball, it moves fastly when there is surface is smooth, whereas when it is bumpy, the speed of the ball reduces. Hence, we can say that the force of friction is caused by the interlocking of irregularities in two surfaces. Now let's see how the weight of the object on the surface affects friction. If an object is quite heavy, the force of friction is more. And if the object is light, the force of friction is less. That is, it is easier to push a light object than a heavier object. So if the object is heavy, the friction is more, and if it is light, the friction is less. So we saw what is friction and what are the factors affecting friction. Now let's see what are the types of friction. There are three types of friction: static friction, sliding friction and rolling friction. So let's see what is static friction. The force required to overcome friction at the instant an object starts moving from rest is called as static friction. Or in simple words, we can say that static friction is a friction that keeps an object at rest. For example, before a penalty kick in football, here the ball is at rest. This is an example of static friction, but when a force is applied, it overcomes this static friction. Similarly, the papers on the tabletop is an example of static friction, and a car which is parked on a hill, here also the brakes are applied. such that the object, which is the car, is at rest. So this is also an example of static friction. Hence we can say that static friction is a frictional force that can be seen when one object is in contact with another, but there is no relative motion. Now let's see what is sliding friction. The term sliding friction refers to the friction created by two objects sliding against each other. That is, it is a frictional force on an object when one object slides over another. For example, here we can see that the penguin slides over the ice. Similarly, the kid sliding down a slide is an example of sliding friction. Here it is actually a friction intended to stop an object from moving. If there is no sliding friction, what happens? The kid might accelerate his speed and might result in having accidents. So it is a force required to keep an object moving with the same speed, and it is also called as kinetic friction. Now let's see the third type of friction, which is rolling friction. When one body rolls over the surface of another body, the resistance to its motion is called as rolling friction. That is, this rolling friction is a frictional force which slows down the motion of a rolling object. For example, if you try moving a heavy trolley and if there are no wheels, it is very hard. Whereas if you use wheels, there would be less friction because of the rolling of the wheels. Hence, rolling reduces friction. So we studied the three types of friction, which is static friction. It is a frictional force that keeps the object at rest. Then we saw sliding friction. Here it is a frictional force when an object slides over another surface. And then we studied rolling friction. It is a frictional force which acts on an object when it rolls over another surface. So the next topic is friction, a necessary evil. So friction is necessary to us. So we'll see the advantages of friction, and friction is evil to us as well. So we'll see the disadvantages of friction. So first let's see how friction is good to us based on certain instances. Friction helps us in holding or picking up objects. If there is no friction, the glass would just slip away. Writing with a pen or a chalk. It is the friction between the pen and the paper which help us to write. Friction helps us in walking, running, standing, etc. as the friction between our soles and that of the ground prevent us from slipping. Fixing a nail. It is a friction which holds a nail after we hammer the nail. Friction, it also affects the motion of an object. If there was no friction, the object, a moving object, would keep on moving. So it is a friction which helps us to bring it to rest. Lighting a matchstick. When we light a matchstick by rubbing a match with the side of the matchbox, it produces heat due to friction. So we can say that friction is necessary for our day-to-day life. Now let's see how friction is evil to us. The friction wears out materials like screws, tires, ball bearings, or the shoes. Friction can produce heat which might even cause damage. That is, when machines are used for a long period of time, it gets heated due to friction. You might have observed the jar of a mixer. It becomes hot when it is run for a certain time. This is due to friction. And because of this heat, a lot of energy is wasted as well. Hence, efficiency is also reduced. Friction, it also opposes the motion of an object. That is, it slows down the object as well. So we can say that. The next topic is increasing and reducing friction. So we saw how friction is very useful for us. If there was no friction, everything would just slide or slip to the lowest point. Even if an object started moving, it would never stop if there was no friction, leading to accidents. Hence we can say that in certain cases, friction is very desirable. So let's see certain measures where we could increase friction. The first one, the sole of a shoe is grooved so as to get a grip. It is done to provide the shoes better grip on the floor so that you can move safely. Similarly, the treaded tires of car, trucks and bulldozers, they provide better grip with the ground. Using brake pads in the brake systems of cycles and cars, it also deliberately increases the friction. Here, while pressing the brake lever, these pads, they arrest the motion of the rim due to friction, thereby stopping the wheel. Kabaddi players or gymnasts, they also rub their hands with soil or with certain coarse substance in order to increase the friction for a better grip. But in certain situations, friction is undesirable, and some of the measures to minimize friction are: we sprinkle fine powder on a carom board so as to reduce the friction between the carom board and the coin. Similarly, a few drops of oil are poured on the hinges of the door such that it reduces the friction and the door could move smoothly. Now, lubricants like grease, oil or graphites are also applied to the moving parts of the machine so as to reduce friction, thereby increasing the efficiency. So, what are lubricants? Lubricants are the substances which reduce frictions. So, by using lubricants like grease, oil or graphite, we could reduce friction, and if friction is reduced, we could increase the efficiency of the machines. Wheels also reduces friction. You might have noticed that in certain trolleys there are wheels attached to the pieces of luggage. This is mainly because it helps in pulling the luggage while it fitted with rollers. Similarly, the use of ball bearings between hubs and axles of the ceilings also reduces friction. So last topic of this chapter is fluid friction. Water and other liquids exert force of friction when the objects move through them. For example, while swimming in the sea, or when a boat or a ship they move in the sea, it also always face a resistance from the water. This is the frictional force of the water. Similarly, the air, it also exerts a frictional force from the objects moving through it. For example, when an aeroplane flies in the air, or if we take the example of a bungee jumping, here we can see that there is a resistance or a friction from the air as well. So we can say that both air as well as water, they exert certain frictional force on the object moving through it. In science, the common name of the gases and liquids is called as fluids, and the frictional force exerted by this fluid is called as drag or fluid friction. So we can say that the fluids, they exert force of friction on the objects in motion through them. Now, the frictional force of an object or the fluid friction depends upon the speed of the object with respect to the fluid, the shape of the object as well as the nature of the fluid. If the speed of the object is more, the fluid friction would also be more. For example, if you are swimming very fastly, the friction that we experience would also be more. Now, the shape of an object. If the surface area of the object is more, the fluid friction would also be more. For example, the friction experienced by a big bus would be more when compared to the friction experienced by a small car. Now, the nature of the fluid. If the fluid is thick or viscous, more would be the fluid friction. For example, here the water is more thicker than that of air. Hence, the friction in water is more when compared to air. Now, when objects move through the fluids, they have to overcome the friction acting on them, and in this process, they lose a loss of energy. So, because of this, efforts are therefore made to minimize friction. So, what are the efforts made to minimize friction? Here, the objects which move through the fluids are given certain special shapes, like that of birds and fishes. If we notice the birds and fishes, we can see that they move through the fluids all the time. Their bodies have evolved to shapes which would make them lose less energy in overcoming friction. Hence, these objects like aeroplanes are designed in the shape of a bird. We can see that these aeroplanes have pointed front and wings like that of the bird. Similar is the case of a submarine or a ship. So these vehicles are designed to have shapes such that it reduces the fluid friction. So that's all for this chapter 12, friction. The next video will be on question and answers of this chapter. Tune in soon for the next session. Don't forget to share, like and subscribe if you find the contents useful. Thank you so much. May God bless you all. Take care and bye-bye.